This video covers the material from Chapter 2. I will cover some of the types of punishment that have existed from as early as 2000 BC. To begin, holding and confining people in jails until individuals were convicted or acquitted has existed throughout history. And so you can note that the word jails was initially spelled as G-A-O-L-S, but it was pronounced jails. But this has existed for a very long time. For example, it was popular in England in the 1100s. So King Henry II actually mandated that jails be built in all English counties to hold people before trial. And at the time, offenders had to pay for their stay of incarceration. And so offenders who were wealthy could afford better accommodations while they were incarcerated. And additionally, at this time, jails were administered by bishops and other church officials. So the underlying goals for these jails, because they were being administered by bishops and other church officials, would be is that people would repent. And so the purpose here was that individuals would remain in solitude, so isolation and silence, to reflect on their actions so that they could repent, hence the common term penitentiary. And another type of punishment that existed in England early on was galley slavery. Individuals who were convicted of crimes were forced to row on a ship until they collapsed from exhaustion or hunger, or until they died from disease, things like that. And at times, individuals weren't even allowed to take a break to relieve themselves, and so they could end up sitting in their own excrement. The video clip that I'm about to show is an example of galley slavery, and this is from a movie that I thought was a good depiction of this. So hopefully that video clip gave you a good example of what galley slavery entailed. And galley slavery, like the next thing that we'll talk about, were designed primarily, and one of the reasons they were designed was to remove the impoverished from specific areas. And so this next type of punishment is another example of punishment that one of its purposes was to remove and keep poor people out of town. So bridewells were essentially workhouses that were designed for punishment, and they began in England in 1553. So they were primarily for minor offenses, disorderly behavior, and the impoverished or poor people. And as I mentioned, with galley slavery, a big part of the reason for bridewells were initiated was to keep poor people out of town. And so these workhouses, as well as galley slavery, really criminalized poverty. And the term debtor's prison became popular when people started being incarcerated in these places for having unpaid debts. And the debtor was required to stay at the bridewell and work until they could pay off of their debt. And pictured here is a bridewell in Liverpool. So there's the front. This is the inside of one of the cells. And again, one of the cells. And interestingly, this has since been transformed and renovated into a hotel. But another type of punishment that existed in the 1600s was called transportation. So people who were sentenced to transportation were transported to a penal colony as servants to that colony. And Norfolk Island, which is pictured here, was a well-known penal colony off the coast of Australia that was established in 1788. And treatments that people endured at such colonies were generally pretty harsh, and they oftentimes experienced brutal and violent conditions. In the 1840s, Alexander Makonicki had become the governor of Norfolk Island, and he had set out to reform that particular penal colony. And he was one of the first to set up privileges and good time, or early release, for good behavior, on the colony. And so the idea of early release is now known as parole, and we'll talk about that term more later in the course. So moving into the 1700s, I had covered the Enlightenment period briefly during Chapter 1. As you know, prior to this, the causes of crime were seen as being influenced by aspects of religion and involved extreme punishments. The Enlightenment period was when people began questioning the way in which religious entities were associated with criminal behavior. At this time, people began to think that crime was a choice, and the ways in which people were punished didn't really change initially, but the ideas of the Enlightenment period made way for the classical perspective. And again, the classical perspective saw crime as being related to free will or choice. However, the classical perspective started seeing extreme punishment as being unnecessary, and particularly for minor offenses. So now we'll go over a few notable people from the classical period. William Penn was the governor of Pennsylvania, who had previously been incarcerated in England for voicing his opinions on religious freedom. And his experiences were part of the reason that he started pushing for penal reform. Instead of corporal punishment and capital punishment being handed down for all crimes, he felt that minor offenses deserved less severe punishments. He assisted in enacting the Great Law of Pennsylvania in 1682 to reform punishment. So this increased the use of incarceration and decreased the use of physical punishment or corporal punishment and capital punishment or death. John Howard was a penal reformer who had also been incarcerated in England, and he advocated for removing the fee systems that were commonly associated with punishment, and particularly because that further criminalized the poor. But additionally, evaluations of correctional facilities in 1776 had found that the incarcerated population consisted of 16% of offenders who were there for petty or minor offenses, 24% were felons who were awaiting trial or were convicted, and people who were awaiting execution or transportation. And then additionally, felons who were convicted and serving their sentence of incarceration. So again, 16% minor offenders, 24% felons. The remaining 60% were debtors. And so one of his reasonings for eradicating fee systems was to reduce the population of debtors. And by doing that, the correctional population could be substantially reduced. And additionally, Howard, had felt that it was important to separate offenders by their characteristics, such as gender and the type of offense that they engaged in. And some of these things are still present in aspects in the United States today. And then finally, at this time in the 1700s, Howard was acknowledging that diseases were extremely common in jails, and so he advocated for more sanitary facilities. And he pushed for implementing required standards for jails and prisons that said correctional facilities would need to be inspected on to ensure that they were meeting such required standards. Caesar Beccaria, as I explained in the video for Chapter 1, is also a prominent classicalist. So he laid the foundation for deterrence theory, and he suggested that punishments should be swift, certain, and severe. Swift being that they would happen quickly after being convicted. Certain being that if someone engaged in the crime, they definitely would be caught and definitely would be punished. And then severe, but not too severe. And so, from this point of view, or his point of view, Beccaria felt that the longer it takes to enact punishment, the less certainty that exists for someone to be punished, and the less severe that a punishment is, the less effective that the punishment would be at preventing and reducing crime. The last person that we're covering as part of the rise of the classical school of thought is Jeremy Bentham, and his views were similar to Beccaria's because he also thought that people weighed decisions on their behavior depending on whether or not it would bring risks or rewards or pleasure or pain. And he also thought that the criminal justice system was too harsh and that it should only be harsh enough to deter crime. And interestingly, the classical movement in general was pretty influential for the development of prisons. And pardon me for having this slide kind of messed up with the pictures. There we go. Before Bentham and Beccaria, for example, people were not imprisoned for long amounts of time. And in fact, correctional facilities were primarily only used to hold people who were awaiting trial, torture, or execution. But as I had said, with the Enlightenment period and then moving into the classical period, the classical perspective really changed the way that punishment occurred, and that included increasing the use of long-term imprisonment. And with that, Jeremy Bentham was known for designing the Panopticon prison. And these types of prisons had a central point for correctional officers to be able to observe inmates on different levels of around facility. And the design didn't actually get implemented while he was alive, so he developed this Panopticon prison, but in his lifetime there was never one actually built. And in general, the Panopticon prison didn't really take off in popularity, although it has somewhat influenced facilities. And you can see pictured on the slides here is an example of a Panopticon prison that has actually since run down. But this, I can't remember what it's called, but this is a Panopticon prison that is located in Cuba. So to close this chapter and segue into chapter 3, we'll start talking more about the specific examples of correctional facilities in the United States. So early on in the United States, the first known jail was in Virginia, and that was established in 1606, and that's what's pictured there. At this time, in the 1600s and even a little bit after that, jails were not built for the purpose of incarcerating people, in the sense that the actual facility that was being used was not originally built to be intended as a jail. So instead, existing houses, inns like hotels or motels, and even other structures such as boats and naval ships were used to jail inmates. And since the facilities weren't originally designed to incarcerate people, sentences weren't initially that long. So this concludes the information for Chapter 2.